was a boy named Adrian who found a locked gate at the end of a path. He'd walked 1,000 times. Tall iron, rusted, a heavy padlock hanging from the latch. Behind it, something beautiful, a garden, overgrown but vibrant, colors bleeding through the bars, the scent of flowers mixing with earth. Adrian wanted in desperately, but the gate was locked, and he had no key. So he did what most people do. He gave up, turned, harooned, walked away, telling himself it was locked. There was no way in. That was that. Days passed, weeks. But Adrian couldn't stop thinking about the garden. What was inside? What secrets did it hold? What beauty was he missing? The questions haunted him, pulled at him, until finally he went back. He stood at the gate, stared at the lock, and this time, instead of turning away, he asked a different question. Not how do I get through, but why is this locked? What am I missing? He examined the gate. Rila looked, and he noticed the hinges were on his side, exposed, rusted but visible, and he realized the lock wasn't the only way. It was just the obvious way. Adrian pulled at the hinges. They were old, weakened by time and weather. With effort, they gave, creaked, bent, and slowly, the gate swung open, not through the lock, but around Italiano. He stepped inside. The garden was more beautiful than he'd imagined, wild, untamed, alive, and at the center, a small stone with words carved into it. The barrier was never the gate. It was the assumption that gates only open one way. Adrian sat on the stone and understood. He'd seen the lock and stopped, accepted it as the final answer. But the lock was just one piece, one possibility, and his assumption that it was the only way had kept him out longer than the gate ever did. An old gardener emerged from the trees, weathered and smiling, observing that Adrian had figured it out. Adrian confirmed the hinges. Yes, the gardener said. Most people see the lock and quit. They think barriers have one solution, one key. And if they don't have it, they're stuck. But barriers are never that simple. There's always another way, another angle, another question to ask. But you have to be curious enough to look. The gardener sat beside him and shared what he'd witnessed. He'd watched hundreds of people stand at that gate, and most he walked away within seconds because they saw locked and thought impossible. They saw a barrier and thought stop. But a few were rare. A few stayed, examined, asked why, wondered how. And those people always found a way in. Adrian asked, why lock it at all? Why put up a barrier? To test curiosity, the gardener explained. To separate the ones who give up from the ones who explore. Because the world is full of locked gates, jobs that say you're not qualified, relationships that seem impossible, dreams that feel out of reach. Most people see the lock and turn around, but the curious ones examine the gate, ask questions, look for hinges, and they discover the barrier was never as solid as it seemed. Adrian stayed in the garden and learned from the gardener. When he left, he carried something with him, not just access to a beautiful place, but a new way of seeing, a new way of approaching barriers. He started noticing them everywhere. The locked gates of his life, the job posting requiring 5 years of experience when he had 3, the conversation he wanted to have but thought impossible, the skill he wanted to learn but believed was too hard. Instead of seeing barriers as walls, he started seeing them as puzzles, questions, invitations to get curious, to ask why, to look for hinges. He applied for the job anyway, writing a letter explaining not why he was qualified, but why he was curious, why he wanted to learn, why the barrier didn't stop him. They hired him not because he met the requirements, but because his curiosity proved he'd figure it out. He had the difficult conversation, not by avoiding the fear, but by examining it, asking why it felt impossible, what he was really afraid of. And he found the hinges, the angle that made it possible. He learned the skill, not by being naturally talented, but by staying curious when it got hard, by asking questions instead of quitting, by looking for different approaches when the obvious one didn't work. Every time, the same lesson. The barrier was never as solid as it seemed. It was just a test, a question. Are you curious enough to look? Patient enough to examine? Creative enough to find another way? Years later, Adrian found another locked gate, different place, different barrier. Same test. And he smiled, because he knew the lock didn't matter. The gate didn't matter. What mattered was the question he asked. Not, how do I get through? But what am I not seeing? What assumptions am I making? What other ways exist? And with that curiosity, the gate always opened that through force, not through luck, but through the willingness to look closer, to wonder longer, to stay curious when others walked away. The truth is this: you're standing at locked gates everywhere. Barriers that seem impossible. Doors that appear closed. Opportunities that look out of reach. And you're doing what most people do, seeing the lock and quitting, accepting the barrier as final, assuming that locked means impossible, that no key means no way. But you're wrong. Because barriers are never that simple. Gates don't only open one way, and the lock is rarely the solution. It's just the obvious answer. The one that keeps the incurious out. But you're not incurious. You're just assuming too much, accepting too quickly, turning away too soon. So go back. Stand at the gate. And instead of staring at the lock, examine everything else. Look for hinges. Look for cracks. Look for angles you missed. Ask questions others didn't ask. Wonder about possibilities others didn't consider. Because curiosity is the cannot to the lock, but to the hinges, to the ways around, to the solutions hiding in plain sight, to the realization that most barriers exist to test whether you're willing to look beyond the obvious. So stay curious. Ask why. Examine how. Wonder what if, and discover that the locked gates of your life were never locked at all. They were just waiting for someone curious enough to find another way. And that someone is you. The moment you stop accepting barriers as final answers and start seeing them as questions, invitations, tests of curiosity. The gate is waiting, not for a key, for someone willing to look for the hinges, and that's you. So look, wonder, explore, and step through. The garden is more beautiful than you imagine, and it was never locked. You just had to be curious enough to find the way in.